The wind in Cheyenne carried dust and whispers that day, but Eliza Granger heard neither. She sat in the corner of the boarding house kitchen, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the envelope in front of her. It was plain. No perfume, no fancy script. Just her name, written in a steady, almost hesitant hand. Miss Eliza Granger, care of Mrs. Hensley's boarding house, Cheyenne, Wyoming territory. She'd received letters before, from men who promised her the moon, only to reveal their hunger for control, for ownership. She learned to burn those without opening them. But this one felt different. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no flattery, no flowery words, just a few lines. I am John Holt, a rancher in Devil's Throat. I need a wife, not for beauty or charm, but for company and honest work. I can't promise much, but I can promise you'll be safe here. Safe. The word hit her like a bullet to the chest. She'd been running for 2 years, from a man whose shadow still seemed to follow her down every street, whose voice still echoed in her nightmares. Safety was a thing she'd stopped believing in. And yet, she found herself folding the letter carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket instead of the fire. Outside, the stagecoach wheels rattled over the street. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cried, and in her mind a question began to take root, one that would not let her sleep that night. Could Devil's Throat be far enough to outrun the past? The morning she left Cheyenne, the sky was the color of tarnished silver, heavy with the promise of rain. Eliza stood on the wooden platform of the stagecoach depot, her carpetbag at her feet, her fingers twisting the hem of her shawl. She'd told no one where she was going, not Mrs. Hensley, not the other boarders, not even the kind-eyed grocer who sometimes slipped her an extra apple. The fewer who knew, the better. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. A man with enough money and rage could buy information faster than a bullet could travel. The stagecoach driver, a wiry man with a tobacco-stained beard, gave her a once-over before tipping his hat. Devil's Throat's a long ride, miss. Not much out there but dust, cattle, and men who don't talk much. That'll do, she said quietly, climbing aboard. Inside, the air smelled of leather, dust, and the faint tang of gun oil. Across from her sat a woman with a baby swaddled in faded calico, and beside her, a miner whose boots were caked with red earth. No one asked questions. In the West, silence was its own kind of courtesy. As the coach lurched forward, Cheyenne began to shrink behind her. The clapboard buildings, the muddy streets, the saloon with its swinging doors. She told herself she wouldn't miss it, but as the miles rolled by, the familiar gave way to the unknown. Endless plains that shimmered under the sun, jagged buttes rising like the bones of the earth, and the occasional lonely windmill creaking in the distance. By the second day, the road grew rougher. The driver warned of bandits along the northern pass, and Eliza noticed the miner's hand resting more often on the butt of his revolver. At night, they camped under a sky so wide it made her feel small enough to disappear. She lay awake, listening to the coyotes howl, wondering if John Holt was anything like the men she'd known, or if he truly meant the word safe. On the third afternoon, the stage rounded a bend, and there it was, Devil's Throat. It wasn't a town so much as a stubborn cluster of buildings clinging to the edge of a canyon. The land was raw and wind-scoured, the kind of place that didn't forgive weakness. A single street ran through it, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with a faded sign, and beyond them, the open range stretching toward the horizon. John Holt was waiting by the hitching post, He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that looked carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. His hat shaded his eyes, but when he tipped it in greeting, she saw they were steady, not warm, not cold, just steady. "Miss Granger," he said, his voice low and even, "you made it." She nodded, unsure what to say. He didn't offer to take her bag. He didn't reach for her hand. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward a buckboard hitched to a pair of bay horses. "Let's get you home before the rain comes." As they rode out of town, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant thunder. Eliza kept her eyes on the horizon, but she could feel his presence beside her, solid, unhurried, like a man who'd learned the value of silence. And for the first time in years, she realized she wasn't afraid of the quiet, but somewhere behind them, in the shadows of the canyon, a pair of eyes watched the buckboard roll away. Eyes that knew her name and the price someone was willing to pay to bring her back. The buckboard rattled over the hard-packed earth, the wheels groaning with every rut and stone. Eliza sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the carpet bag wedged between her boots. The land around them was vast and raw, a rolling sea of sagebrush and golden grass, broken only by the dark silhouettes of cottonwoods along a distant creek. John Holt didn't speak much. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the reins loose in his hands, his posture easy but alert. Every so often he glanced at the sky, as if measuring the distance of the storm that had been stalking them since they left town. "You've come a long way," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Eliza hesitated. "Farther than you know." He didn't press her, just gave a small nod, as though he understood that some truths needed time, or maybe never, to be told. They crested a rise, and there it was. Holt Ranch. It wasn't grand. No white fences or sprawling verandas like the ranches she'd seen in dime novels. Just a sturdy two-story house of weathered timber, a barn with a fresh coat of red paint, and a corral where a few horses lifted their heads to watch the newcomers. Beyond that, the land stretched toward the horizon, dotted with cattle and framed by the jagged teeth of the canyon walls. John pulled the team to a stop. "It's not much," he said, "but it's honest." She stepped down from the buckboard, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of rain and horses, of wood smoke drifting from the chimney. For a moment she just stood there, taking it in, the quiet, the space, the absence of eyes watching her every move. Inside, the house was simple but clean. A stone hearth dominated the main room, its fire crackling against the chill. A table stood near the window, set with two mismatched chairs. On the wall hung a rifle, polished and ready. "I'll show you your room," John said, leading her up the narrow stairs. It was small, a bed, a dresser, a single window looking out over the pasture. But the quilt on the bed was neatly folded, and a vase of wildflowers sat on the sill. She touched the petals, surprised. "My sister left those," John said from the doorway. "She thought it might make the place feel less empty." Eliza turned to him. "It's kind." He shrugged, almost embarrassed. "You'll find we do things plain here, but plain can be good." That night the rain came hard, drumming on the roof, rattling the shutters. Eliza lay awake, listening to it, her mind drifting between the safety of the walls and the memory of nights when storms had meant danger, when a knock at the door could shatter everything. Downstairs she heard John moving about, checking the windows, stoking the fire. His footsteps were measured, unhurried. She realized he was making sure the house was secure, and yet, Far beyond the ranch, in the black mouth of the canyon, a lone rider sat astride his horse, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He watched the faint glow of the Holt ranch windows, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. He'd found her. The storm passed in the night, leaving the land washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. Morning light spilled across the pasture in long golden bands, catching on the dew that clung to the grass like tiny shards of glass. Eliza stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the horizon. She'd slept little. The sound of rain had been soothing, but the memory of that rider in her dreams had not. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, dredging up old fears. But deep down, she knew better. John emerged from the barn, his hat pulled low, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd been doing the same work for years, checking the fence lines, feeding the stock, tending to the horses. There was a steadiness to him that unsettled her in a strange way. She wasn't used to men who didn't fill the air with words or demands. "You're up early," he said, pausing at the porch steps. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the corral. "Come on, I'll show you how to saddle a horse proper. Might be you'll need to ride one day." The lesson was awkward at first, her hands clumsy on the leather straps, her skirts catching on the stirrup. But John was patient, guiding her without touching, his voice calm and even. By the time she'd cinched the saddle tight, she felt a small flicker of pride. "That's good," he said simply. "You'll do fine here." The words warmed her more than she expected. By midday, the sun was high, and the air carried the faint hum of cicadas. John hitched the wagon to haul supplies from the far pasture, and Eliza offered to ride along. The trail wound through open range, past clusters of cottonwoods, and over shallow creeks where the water ran clear and cold. It was peaceful, until John's gaze sharpened on a set of tracks in the mud. He pulled the team to a stop, crouched down and studied them. "Not one of mine," he murmured. "Ryder came through here last night." Alone, Eliza's stomach tightened. "Could be a drifter?" "Could be," he said, but his tone carried weight. "Or someone looking for something." They moved on, but the easy rhythm of the day was gone. John's eyes scanned the ridges, the tree lines, the shadows that pooled in the folds of the land. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, John set a lantern on the porch and leaned against the railing. Eliza joined him, the air cooling fast now that the light was fading. "You ever been to Devil's Throat before?" he asked. She shook her head. "I've been to places like it, but never here." He didn't ask more and she didn't offer. Some truths were still too raw to speak aloud. A coyote yipped in the distance, answered by another. The sound was wild, lonely, and yet somehow fitting for this place. Then, faint but clear, came the rhythmic thud of hooves. John straightened, his hand resting on the butt of the revolver at his hip. Out beyond the fence line, a lone rider appeared, silhouetted against the dying light. He didn't approach, just sat there, watching. Eliza's breath caught. Even at this distance, she felt the weight of that gaze. John's voice was low, steady. "You know him?" She swallowed hard. I think he's from Cheyenne." The rider turned his horse, disappearing into the folds on the land as silently as he'd come. John didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, "Lock the doors tonight." "All of them." That night the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Eliza lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of hooves. She thought of the letter that had brought her here, of the word safe, and wondered if such a thing truly existed in the West, or if safety was just another promise that could be broken. Downstairs, John sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees, the lantern casting long shadows on the walls. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but he knew trouble when he saw it, and trouble had just found its way to Holt Ranch. The next morning dawned pale and cold, the kind of light that made the land look sharper, more dangerous. Eliza rose before the sun, drawn to the window by an unease she couldn't shake. The pasture lay quiet, the cattle grazing in the distance, but the stillness felt wrong, like the air before a storm. Downstairs, John was already at the table, a mug of coffee in one hand, his rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach. He looked up as she entered. "Tracks again," he said simply. "Fresh ones." Whoever he is, he's circling. Eliza's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "He's not going to stop." John studied her for a long moment. "Then we won't run." "Not here." The day passed in a slow, taut rhythm. John worked the ranch as usual, but his eyes were always scanning the ridges, the tree lines, the places a man could hide. Eliza tried to busy herself in the kitchen, but every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters made her heart jump. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. The wind carried the smell of rain again, and with it, the faint, unmistakable sound of hooves. John stepped onto the porch, his hand resting on the rifle. Eliza followed, her breath catching as the rider emerged from the canyon's shadow. He was tall in the saddle, his coat dark and slick from the mist, his hat pulled low. Even from a distance, she knew the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins. Controlled, predatory. "Hello, Eliza," the man called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Her blood went cold. "Clay Maddox," she whispered. John's gaze flicked to her, then back to the rider. "Friend of yours?" "Not even close," she said, her voice shaking. "He's the one I ran from." Maddox dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the fence as if he had all the time in the world. "You've been hard to find," he said, walking toward them, "but I always get what's mine." "She's not your," John said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Maddox's smile was thin. "You think you can keep her? You don't know what she's done, what she owes." Eliza's hands trembled, but she stepped forward. "What I owe is nothing to you. You took enough from me already." Maddox's eyes narrowed. "You think this rancher's going to save you? Men like him don't fight for women like you." John moved then, not fast, not loud, but with the kind of certainty that made Maddox stop in his tracks. "You've got two choices," John said. "Turn around and ride out of here, or stay and find out how far I'll go to keep my word." The wind rose, rattling the barn doors. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Maddox's hand twitched toward his gun. John's rifle came up in the same breath, the barrel steady, his eyes locked on the other man's. For a long, dangerous moment, no one moved. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, the creak of leather, the whisper of the wind through the grass. Then Maddox's smile returned, colder this time. "This isn't over," he said, stepping back. "You can't hide her forever." He mounted his horse, turned, and rode toward the canyon, his figure swallowed by the shadows. The rain came hard after he was gone, drumming on the roof, turning the yard to mud. John set the rifle aside and looked at Eliza. "You all right?" She nodded, though her knees felt weak. "He'll be back." "Maybe," John said. But so will I. Something in his tone, not a promise, not a boast, just a simple truth, settled deep in her chest. For the first time in years, she believed it. That night, they sat by the fire, the storm raging outside. John didn't ask for her story and she didn't offer it. But when he poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her, his hand brushed hers. Steady, warm, real. She realized then that safety wasn't a place, it wasn't a locked door or a distant town. It was a person who stood beside you when the danger came, who didn't flinch, who didn't walk away. And in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West, Eliza Granger had found that person. Final image for the audience. The storm passes. Morning breaks over Holt Ranch. Eliza steps onto the porch, the air crisp and clean, the land stretching wide and free before her. John is already in the corral, working with the horses, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. She smiles, not because the danger is gone, but because she knows she's not facing it alone. Fade out.